Hey there, Chad here with another episode of Kerbal Space Program in 2021. In this episode, I'm going to talk about what I consider to be the most complicated space procedure, and that is rendezvous. A rendezvous is when two space vehicles move into close proximity to do something like dock. The actual rendezvous has more to do with what is called station keeping, and that is maintaining a specific distance from another body while it orbits a third body. Before we get started, I want to do some quick housekeeping. I haven't done a video in a couple of months, and that is primarily because I had a hard drive failure. I did have a backup, but it was a couple of episodes old, and in the process of getting everything set back up, I got a little bit out of sync with how the video series has gone so far. So it is possible you will see some things that aren't things we had already discussed in previous videos. I've been trying to keep this as almost like a real time of playing through the game. This is going to depart from that a little bit, unfortunately, and videos in the future will probably stay on the track that this one sets. I apologize for that. If there's any confusion, don't hesitate to leave a comment and I'll try to help you get back on track as best I can. Also, if you are a veteran of my video series, you will know that this one is done a little bit differently. I'm narrating it after I've put the video together. Usually I do the narration during the process of recording the video, but with Rendezvous being as complicated as it is, I wanted to have a clean picture of where I was going with things and then kind of explain over it. I don't know how well it's going to work. It's kind of an experiment. We'll see how this video goes. Hope you'll bear with me and continue watching the rest of the series. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump on in. For the purposes of this video, I've created two rockets. One is called Hotel. It is an unmanned rocket. It will use a probe core to command it, and it will go on station. It will launch and go up to 100,000 meters, basically, and then orbit there. The second one is called Elevator, and that is going to have a Mark I command pod, and it's going to take Jeb up, and then Jeb is going to dock with Hotel. So the elevator will go to the Hotel. Jeb will then move between modules. I'll show you how that's done, and then he will climb back into the command pod. It will detach from the station, and it will return to the planet. Let's take a quick look at Hotel and see what it looks like. It has a control wheel, which basically allows for maneuverability of the ship without using external ports for maneuvering. It basically is gyroscopes that spin and keep the craft stable or allow it to be moved in any of its three axes. I've also put a couple of lights on it to allow it to be spotted from a distance a little easier, although that's not entirely necessary. Critical to this mission is the docking port. This is a docking port junior, and I put it on the very top of the ship. Docking ports connect to one another. I have the passenger cabin there. It allows for two passengers to ride in it. I've got a few solar panels. I have two batteries on there so that we don't run out of power. You do not want to run out of power while you're orbiting. To adjust the orbit, I've used some smaller engines that can be fired to try to circularize the orbit as much as possible. That's not entirely necessary. These are pretty lightweight and small engines comparatively. The engine is the skipper, and then as you can see there, that is the kickback. The bottom of the rocket is actually way overpowered. There's probably enough fuel here to do this whole launch twice, but I just didn't want it to mess up. I'm going to take the Hotel rocket out to the pad and launch it. You'll notice there that I'm using the launch stability enhancer on the sides there. When I first attempted to launch this rocket, when it sat on the pad, it fell over, and I'm not really sure why. It could be something is misaligned, as you'll notice as it moves up and I start to roll it here, or yaw it, it wants to roll. There's a very strong roll occurring in there. I haven't figured out why that was happening. I just dealt with it. It seems to go away after the solid rocket boosters drop off. I'm going to accelerate this while it climbs out and establishes an orbit, but while it does that, I thought I'd give a quick history on Rendezvous. The United States tried its first rendezvous with Gemini 4 in June of 1965, and it failed. The command pilot was James McDivitt, And effectively, the idea was he would rendezvous with the upper stage of the Titan II rocket that had put them in space. One of the difficulties they had is there was no radar on the Gemini 4 to give an exact range to the target, so they were eyeballing it. McDivitt and the pilot, Ed White, had different ideas of how far away they were. One thought they were 400 to 500 feet from the target initially. The other thought they were 200 feet from the target. After some maneuvering, they thought they were closer, but they had very different ideas on how close they were. By the end of the attempt, they felt that they were anywhere from half a mile away to 3/4 of a mile away, according to McDivitt. The problem was this. Gene Kranz talks about it in his autobiography. The premise was simple. McDivitt pointed the capsule at the expended rocket and fired the maneuvering thruster a little bit, just to start nudging them in that direction. And they were going into the shadow of the Earth, and they thought, okay, we'll give it, the 30, 45 minutes to clear that, and we'll see where we are. They expected to be closer. And when they came out of the shadow, they were, instead of being, less than 200 feet away from the capsule, they were now, as much as a mile away from the rocket. And they couldn't explain that. And it turns out the reason for that was NASA had not figured out how orbital mechanics worked yet. This was the 8th manned mission, and I believe there were 2 technically space flights by aircraft, the X-1 I think being one of those. But this was the 8th mission of the Mercury and then Gemini series, and NASA still didn't know how Rendezvous worked. Russia was in no better straits. They had been attempting some form of rendezvous since 1962. They would launch rockets a day or two apart from the same launch pad, and they would try to get those orbits to intersect. And they had no luck at that at all. They would initially start just a few kilometers apart, and by the end of their mission, they'd be 1,000 miles away from where they started. They did not understand why this was happening. The United States, after the Gemini 4, went back and had the engineers take another look at what was happening, and they discovered that orbital mechanics don't work the way you would expect things to work if you were on the planet. So if we are on a football field and we're at opposite ends and we want to move something from one end to the other, you generally point it in the direction you want it to go, and you give it some sort of thrust. You push it or roll it or whatever. And that moves you in the direction that you need to go. And, assuming there's no friction, you would continue in that direction until something acts on you to stop in the other direction. That was kind of the thought. We'll point the rocket at the stage or at the target. We'll fire the engine just a little bit. These were the maneuvering engines. It was not the big launch engine. And over time, we'll close that gap and we will tighten things up. The problem is orbital mechanics don't work that way. What works here on Earth is entirely counterintuitive out in space. McDivitt was in a retrograde, and so he was, when he fired when he executed the maneuver, he was slowing the capsule down, which on the other side of the orbit was lowering the orbit. And when something is in a lower orbit, it accelerates. It's moving faster. It's not so much it accelerates, but it is moving faster at that point. So as these orbits moved around to the other side, they got more disparate, and it caused a bigger gap because the capsule was now moving faster than the Titan II stage. That was the problem. NASA hadn't really planned through that or what that needed to look like, but between Gemini 4 and Gemini 6, they figured it out. They knew what was going on, and they basically understood how orbital mechanics needed to work at that point. The first successful rendezvous was done between Gemini 6 and Gemini 7. Wally Schirra was the command pilot of Gemini 6 and pulled within just about a foot of Gemini 7, which had launched a couple of days before it, despite the numbers. That was because they wanted to make sure this rendezvous thing worked, and they shuffled their schedule a little bit. The first actual docking occurred with Gemini 8, and that occurred in March of 1966. So in June of 65, we had a failed rendezvous. Then in December of 65, we had a successful rendezvous, and it was really a station-keeping orbit that was held. They were able to hold the two craft very close proximity for an extended period of time. Then, of course, the docking occurred in March of 1966. As for the Russians, it took them quite a while yet. It took them 2 more years to properly dock 2 spacecraft. They didn't get it done until 1968. While I was given that little history lesson, some of the things that were going on screen were really just the circularization of the orbit. If you look at that, the Apo and Perry are about 1,000 meters apart, right around 100,000 meters. So we have a reasonably circular orbit. What will happen next is I will launch the other rocket, catch up with this, and then we will do a dock. We are going to skip the historical rendezvous test of just floating next to each other, as docking kind of accomplishes that at the same time. I held on to the larger stage a little longer just to make sure I had a lot of fuel. With Hotel safely in orbit, let's flip over to the other rocket, Elevator. Elevator includes thruster blocks, there's 4 of them around the top up there. And what those are the maneuvering thrusters. They allow us to adjust the attitude of the capsule while it is in space. These become extremely, not even helpful, but necessary during a docking maneuver. You have to make very small changes. These allow us to adjust it to the proper attitude in order to actually make the dock. There is a docking port on the top of this capsule. You'll notice the parachutes on the sides. Also, you'll notice those 4 round tanks. Those are the monopropellant tanks. That's the fuel that is used by the thrusters. Monopropellant is in real life is really basically a hydrogen peroxide kind of mix that is used to maneuver the rocket in very small steps. Now, before we actually launch this rocket, what we want to do is see where our target is in its orbit. So we'll flip over to the broader view here, and as you can see, it's out there. It's a little bit ahead of us right now. We're going to fast forward until it comes all the way around to about 30 to 45 degrees off of where we are. And we're going to launch right about here and meet up with it, or at least make that rendezvous as close as possible. I'm going to go ahead and fast forward here until we get into orbit and get ready to start making maneuvers in order to conduct the rendezvous. Slowed it down here again so you can see how close the second rocket is to the first as we start to circularize its orbit as close to the other one as possible. Okay, so let's take a look at what we have here, and our 2 capsules are pretty close together, but you'll notice they're not in the same plane. It's actually kind of a significant deviation there. So what we do is we set the target capsule. You right click it and select it as target, and you can see some of the specifics, including our distance and things like that from that target. What we want to do, the very first step is we want to, and I don't know why that was there, we want to be on the same plane. So we literally want to be flying in the same plane, and the way you do that is you go to where the planes intersect, and which is the node, it's the ascending or descending node, and you put in a maneuver and you adjust it in the appropriate direction. That'll line up those planes, and that'll get us the first step of how we get as close as possible to the other ship. Second thing we will want to do is pay attention to these intersects, and usually there'll be one or two of those will show up. One will be a brighter color and the other one duller, and one is the first pass, or the first intersection, and the second one is the second intersection. So if you think about it, think of a circle intersecting an ellipse, pardon me. um, the trajectories vary a little bit, but at some point they can intersect more than once. What we're going to do is adjust the orbit in any means necessary to bring the separation and the relative speed down to as close to zero as possible. So right now we have a separation of the one on the far side, intersection 2, of 0.2 kilometers, and that's about as close we can get. So that's 200 meters. That's pretty close, actually. In fact, that's close enough for us to complete the rendezvous. Now, the other thing you'll notice there is the speed. That's the relative speed between the two vehicles when they pass. And at 40 meters per second, that again is something we can adjust. As you can see, I was able to adjust this out to 0 for the distance. Now, very, very, very small chance they would actually collide, but not impossible. And I'll speed this up again, and we will watch the ship kind of float to its node where it wants to execute that burn. It's a relatively short burn. You'll notice here I'm going to use the maneuvering jets. You can see there the propellant coming out. You do that by clicking the RCS button there or hitting R on your keyboard, and that allows you to maneuver it. It does spend that fuel, though. You'll notice in the upper right corner the amount of propellant will go down as that gets used. Also, we can see the target there in the distance. That's the ship that we want to eventually rendezvous with. So we'll want to kind of pay attention to that as this goes forward. What you'll see here is that burn didn't get us quite as close as we had hoped. We're still off by a couple of kilometers there. So I'm going to just do a manual burn here to try to shorten that up some. I'm still in the same attitude, so it should just tighten it up just a touch. And there we go, and it's dropping down 1 kilometer down to 0.2. I think that'll get us where we want to go. I will warp forward here, and then we will start the process of the maneuvers in order to complete the docking. At this point, the ships are about 2,000 meters apart and getting a little bit closer together. And what's happening here isn't terribly obvious, but if you look at the nav ball, you'll notice it says target. There's a few different things it can say there. Sometimes it'll say orbit, sometimes it'll say surface. I have a target selected, so what this is showing me is the target's trajectory compared to the ship I'm currently controlling. My ship is what I'll call that. And what this says is that the target is traveling at a delta of 41.9 meters per second. What I'm doing is lining up on the retro of the target. So I'm basically pointing retrograde of the vectors between my ship and the target ship. And I'm going to fire the engine to slow that down a little bit. You'll notice fired the engine, now it's down to well, it was down to 21, now it's down to 2.1 meters. And effectively, I'm narrowing the gap of the speed between the ships. Now, the ships are still pretty far apart at this point, although that's down to 315 meters at this point. Next, what I'm doing is I'm flipping the ship over, and I hit V a couple of times until it said locked at the top of the screen. What locked does is it keeps the camera exactly where you put it. So I put the camera directly behind it. Then I turned on my docking camera, and I'm basically pointing at the ship, trying to close that distance. Now, I know what I said earlier about Gemini 4 and McDivitt. The difference here is we're in a very similar orbit to the other ship right now. So really, we're almost in a station keeping orbit. And at this point, we're down to, what is it? Well, we're virtually no difference in our speed. And I'm getting rid of the rocket there. I don't need it anymore. From here on out, I'm going to use monopropellant and the maneuvering thrusters. I thought I'd let that stage float around so it would give a reference point for where things kind of are. If it comes back into view, we can talk about that. Real quick though, I want to freeze this and I want to talk about the docking port alignment indicator. This is a mod. This is one of the mods that I use. It's important to understand what the icons on it are though, and what it does. So first of all, when you target a ship, there's a point on the ship it targets, and generally it'll find something that makes sense. In this case, when we targeted it, it picked the docking port that's on that ship, so that makes sense. So right now, that's our actual target on the ship. That's what that says there, Clampetron Docking Port Junior. That's what we're pointed at. So those icons, you'll notice there's a big, we'll call it an airplane, and then there's a smaller one that's closer to the center. The small one indicates the three-dimensional direction to the target. And there's a couple of things that come into play. So you'll notice it looks like it's a little above us, and we're probably pointing a little to the right of it. And it's showing below and to the right. That has to do with how you align. But basically, if you point the crosshairs directly at that and thrust forward, you'll eventually run into your target. The large airplane shows our docking attitude compared to the target. So the target is always considered to be correct. And then what we would do is move the ship in its three dimensions, but mostly by rolling or pitching or yawing. And we want to align that to the direct center. And when that happens, and when we are pointed directly at the target, we could basically move directly forward and it would be a perfect dock. You'll notice those bars though, there's a horizontal and a vertical bar. What those are showing us are the amount of drift that is occurring currently with respect to our speeds. So right now, my ship is drifting up a little, I think here, and then a little bit to the right compared to the other ship. So what I want to do is use the maneuvering jets. And to use the maneuvering jets on my keyboard, it is I, K, L, and J. So that's your directionals, up, down, left, and right. And then H and N are forward and backward. Okay, so that's your three dimensions. You can move in all those dimensions. And then, of course, your ASDW and I think Q and E, that's the way I have it set up. Those are the rotation, the attitude of your ship. So you use ASDW, Q, and E to do the alignment, and then you use the J, K, L, I, H, and N. Those are what you use to actually start moving your ship in the different directions once it is perfectly aligned. You'll also notice at about, we'll call it 1:30 on the clock, there's a bar that's kind of pointing at a 45-degree angle. That is the rotational difference between my ship and the other ship. Right now, it doesn't really matter. You could align that, and I think it would make some of the directions a little better. You would probably want to point it either straight up or straight down. For these docking ports, it is not important. It can be at any rotation, and that is not a problem. You'll also notice that there's a distance indicator, and there's also velocity indicators to tell you how fast you're moving or not. So let's get back to it. I should point out there is a docking alignment tool built into KSP. It's down there in the lower left corner. You have to click one of those buttons till you get it to pull up. The early iterations of it, though, it was not very usable or user-friendly anyway. I found this mod. I love the mod, so I just have used that. I have not really explored how to use the other docking system that's built in. So what I'm doing here is just adjusting the ship to get it aligned the way I want. Currently, I'm moving in the direction of the target, and I'm just trying to get myself aligned to it. The lines, the horizontal line and the vertical line on the docking computer or indicator are basically showing me my directions off from the center line. And I then adjust those with the thrust to zero them out or null those values. Everything is perfectly centered here, and if I'm being perfectly honest, this is one of the easiest docks I've ever done. Almost never does everything kind of allow it to line up this easily and quickly and without all that much drift. So this one, I'm pretty happy with it. It's just a matter of closing the distance at this point. A little bit of thrust should start to close that up right away. I think I misspoke a little bit ago in talking about the docking indicator and the lines that are moving on it, the horizontal and vertical line. Those are not, I don't think those have to do with the actual velocity that you're moving in those directions. I think that's basically you're off from center, and it's showing you, in this case, it's saying I'm to the left and above. And what I do is thrust in those directions. Sometimes because the ship is rolled upside down, it might be reversed, and that's something to pay attention to. But ultimately, I just thrust in the direction of the line until the line floats back down to the middle. I use the small icon for the target ship to kind of help me judge how much thrust I need to do. Is it a meter per second or 20 meters per second? A little bit of playing with it, and that should kind of make some sense, and you'll see how that works. We are about to see the magnetic connection between these docking points ports kick in, and you'll see they just kind of suddenly snap together, and we are docked. And there's our ship from a distance. So now hotel and elevator are docked. They are basically one ship, but there are multiple compartments on it that can support Kerbals. Jeb is currently in the command capsule, but he can also move over to the room there on the hotel rocket that allows for 2 passengers, the crew cabin. In order to do that, first of all, I'm going to do some housekeeping here. There's no crew report to do. The other thing I noticed is we had the world record for doing Rendezvous, and as you can see, you get a little bit of money and a little bit of science for that, and some prestige. You can always use more prestige. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that, clear it out. So moving Jeb from the capsule into that room there. Basically, the way this is done is by, I also want to note that there's 2 live engines on this craft, and they're pointing in different directions. We could fire them both and see who wins. There's certainly something you could do. I'd rather not do that. Typically when you join them, it figures out staging as best it can, and you won't see that immediately happen, but you can activate the engines by going through the staging so that they would both fire. So transferring Jeb. We click on the capsule, and one of the options there is to transfer. And when you click that, it allows you to click where you want him to transfer to. So I did that, and now Jeb is in the crew cabin there that seats 2. That's what we've been using for passengers in the previous episodes. I don't want to return Jeb back to the planet from there, so I'll move him back to the capsule here. And as you can see, you click transfer. We're going to do an EVA first. Let's take a look at EVA. So EVA is extravehicular activity, and that's going to send Jeb outside, and he will do a spacewalk. The first spacewalk was done by Ed White on Gemini 4. So while Gemini 4 did have the failure of Rendezvous, it did have the success of a spacewalk. It was a thrilling story, and they were concerned that they weren't going to be able to get him back into the capsule for a couple of reasons. Specifically, the capsule door shifted in size when they opened it. If you think about it, it's in a vacuum. There's no heat. It gets cool. Metal contracts when it gets cold. When the sun's blaring on it, it heats up, and the metal expanded and contracted. They were concerned that they may not be able to get it resealed for re-entry. They did, of course, and McDivitt and Ed White came home successfully, but that was the first space EVA. Of course, it was tethered. Jeb has a super fancy suit here that he doesn't need to be tethered for, but he can float around, and then he can grab onto the capsule and jump back in. And I just remembered, this isn't Jeb actually. This is the lovely Valentina. I had to put her on this mission to get her a little bit of experience so she can start leveling up to make the future missions a little easier. The only thing left to do here right now is to undock and re-enter. So I've already done the undock. I didn't have a really good camera angle of it. Basically, you right click on one of the docking ports and you literally select undock and it separates you. Sometimes you end up in the wrong ship. It'll have you targeting the other ship. And you just have to tell it select target and switch back is really what happens there. There was my first deorbit burn. You saw the other half of the well, we'll call it base, this takeoff. The hotel part went zooming by. It was actually because we were slowing down the capsule, not so much that it was speeding up, of course. And the rest of this reentry is fairly straightforward. Doing a little bit to kind of adjust where my entry point is going to be in the water. I wanted to try to get as close to the base as I could. And there it looks like I'd be landing on the peninsula next over from where the space station is. One thing I noticed here when I separate it for my final stage, I did not put any ablator on here. I don't have a heat shield. I was a little concerned about that. The capsule is fairly resilient, and in this case it survived just fine. We'll go ahead and finish the video with the burn, the re-entry burn and the splashdown. I'll accelerate those though so that we're not wasting a whole bunch of air time. Rendezvous, probably the hardest thing you'll do in Kerbal Space Program, and one of the most useful as well. One of the projects I will tackle in the future is building a permanent space station around the planet that can be used for refueling. Also, one of the modules that you eventually get is a space lab. It's a laboratory that you put in space, and when you bring some of the science to it and deliver it to that station, the station processes it and it increases the value of the science. It takes time. You have to have a researcher there, and as he or she works, the science points collect and you eventually transmit them down to the planet and you have more science points. I believe if you use multiple bases to do it, if you like have one around the moon and then you have one around the planet, sending the data between those increases the value. I don't quite remember how that worked. I always found it very efficient to simply have one base that had a lab on it and transmit my science to that lab. That always worked real well for me. I never had really a problem with that, and I was getting plenty of science. The science tree does, you can conquer it pretty easily with some of the more basic things that you do. Once we land on the moon and Minmus, there will be tons more science points coming just from doing samples of the soil and things like that. Soil or the dust, I suppose. During this capsule re-entry, as I mentioned, I didn't have a heat shield and I was a little concerned, but one of the things the flight engineer does there is tracks the hottest spot on the ship. So what I was monitoring here was the critical thermal percentage of the critical part. And I don't think it ever went above like 47 or 48%. The rest of the mission, though, is pretty straightforward. We'll fast forward through the descent to the water. I didn't think about it, but with 2 parachutes, I probably opened a little higher than I needed to. It took forever for the capsule to get back down to the water at 3 meters a second. But it gets there eventually. I did another EVA while I was floating down. You might have seen Valentina stick her nose out there for a moment. There was no more science to collect there. That about wraps it up for this episode. I will probably do a sidebar on some rendezvous stuff, kind of demonstrate some of the potential problems that you can run into. But I think this episode kind of went over some pretty decent stuff. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to leave them in the comments, and I'll try to address them as best I can, either with a response there or through another video. Thanks again for your time, and until next time, fair travels.